Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on our live web chat from WYES. I'm Marcia Kavanaugh with WYES, Director of Local Initiatives, and joining me is Lucia Ledoux with Baptist Community Ministries. Lucia is Vice President of Public Safety and Governmental Oversight Grants at BCM. I got that right?
You did.
Okay. First, I want you to sort of tell me more about Baptist Community Ministries, the work that you guys do in the community.
Well, we give grants in health, education, public safety, and governmental oversight. Generally speaking, our purpose is to improve the health of the community, and that means socially, emotionally. We want everybody to be safe and have a productive life. So our grants cover the waterfront in terms of what helps people succeed and be well in the community. Criminal justice as such really became a much more integrated concern in that you had there was an alliance of individuals in the southeast as part of the state that included the U.S. Attorney, the Supreme Court, regional law enforcement, where questions that had really not been taken up for quite some time were ever, for example, restoring crime lab functionality to New Orleans. There were a group of people who met around that particular subject and waded through the possibilities for bringing back crime lab capacity. At the end of the day, there was a decision not to have regional crime laboratories, but it was a very different manner of doing business for people even to sit down and talk about it. Mm-hmm. How would prisoners be managed? What would be the protocols? There wasn't indigent defense services, really. They were completely and totally reorganized after the storm. But you had lawyers and correctional officers and everybody else in the system displaced. So it really did set the stage for an entirely different way of thinking about how you sort of paste this thing back together again temporarily, and then how do you look at it going forward. You just take the sort of decisions that individual households had to make. Will we rebuild? Will we not rebuild? Where will we rebuild? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Kind of ramp those up and apply them to public institutions, and that's what was happening. So in that context, there were many more discussions between and among those agencies about how to get the system back up and running. At that time, the members of the council then, and particularly James Carter, who was then the chair of the Criminal Justice Committee, brought in the Vera Institute and asked them to kind of take a look at this. Vera is a very reputable national organization. They've worked all over the world, in fact, helping people establish or reestablish or improve criminal justice systems in one area of functionality or another. So they came in and sort of took a broad overview, gave a report to the council, and we were asked to see if there was anything we could do to help. So we funded some technical assistance and some capacity building for organizations to bring folks to the table. That was at the time labeled as the Criminal Justice Leadership Alliance, and it was unprecedented at the moment. Naturally, electoral politics being what it is, different DA, different superintendent, some different judges, some the same. But really what stuck and what was the most important thing was the idea that it was possible for people to begin to address these problems collectively. So that's really how we played into it. We funded some of the things that Vera touched on in its report years before. I mean, the issue of bail and bonds was taken up by the Metropolitan Crime Commission in 1999, and its report of then is still available on its website. Again, in 2003, they looked at bonding in Jefferson Parish. So bail and bonding and the attendant questions is not one that we're taking up for the first time. But this is a different environment now, and a different state of readiness to not just talk about it or look at it, but actually begin to make some moves to change it.
Right. And so some of the recommendations that had come out before through the Vera recommendations and the Alliance coming together, such as summons in lieu of arrest, etc.
Right.
We're seeing some of those now, as we just saw in the program that hopefully you guys just watched.
Hopefully, yes.
They're now actually being implemented. And one important thing certainly is pretrial services. And let me get to a question that was sent in by one of our viewers, and he was questioning. It was from Ridge. I'm going to assume it's a he. I'd like to ask a follow-up from the old show about pretrial services. Old show is referring to in 2008, we did an hour broadcast, which is archived on the WYES website, where we talked about the recommended changes. So in essence, this 2012 show is really a follow-up to let everybody know what indeed has been accomplished and what still needs to be accomplished. He goes on to say, it sounds like something we really needed. How did the pilot work? Because there was a pilot program for pretrial. And where do things stand? What will the program be doing next year? Well, that was covered a bit in the program, but I know Lucy has some more stuff to add about pretrial services. Are we pleased with the direction it's going?
Well, I think I am, and I think I speak on behalf of our body corporate that there's definite return on investment developing here. The pilot that just finished was a 3-month pilot, so the data runs through the 3 months just prior to August 31st. That was the cutoff date. And really, the sort of heartening thing about this is that you frequently hear people say it's really different in New Orleans, or we can't do that here, or any one of a number of sort of discouraging words, if you will, about our possibility of making change. But our data for the pilot actually tracks national data where people have tried this. So in a 3-month pilot, the pretrial people screened 928 cases. And those cases sorted themselves out according to low, medium, and high risk, as they did in other parts of the country. You find a significant number of low-risk cases, and in this case we had 102 of those 98, or 11%, were low risk and were ROR'd.
Released on their own recognizance.
Correct. You had 40.
No, they didn't have to put up a bond.
45 that were released on public surety bonds. You agree to help me get out of jail, and you put up your house as collateral, and then of course you bother me to make sure that I appear. Relatively speaking to some other forms of bail around the country, we find that usually gets a pretty good result. Those were low and moderate risk individuals. There were 45 of those that were released on PSBU bonds, they call them, or 16%. Then there were 118 people who got commercial bonds or low fee bonds or cash payment bonds, 13% of those. There were reminder calls made. What we find is that one of the primary reasons that people don't show up in court is because the process of getting bonded and getting out of jail means that you don't always leave being really clear about when your court date is. And so failure to appear, as noted in the program, in fact, Dr. Cowan, I think, made this point very clearly, you want people to be safe, so you don't want really hardened criminals or scary folks or folks with histories of gun use getting out of jail free, so to speak. But you also want people to come back to court, because that impedes the efficiency of the court if they don't come back. But 93% of these folks came back. One person out of that low and moderate risk group was rearrested that they know of. The data is incomplete. Could be that somebody else was rearrested. We simply don't know. So, you know, I would say to Ridge that what's happening is we're seeing the distribution of the cases shake out in accordance with national findings. We're, I think, moving along toward finding out what else has to be done to our instrument to make sure that it's valid. That's always the trick here.
That's the risk assessment instrument.
Exactly.
That you're talking about.
You know, it has to give you the kind of information that's really going to tell you what the possibilities are. You know, everyone's familiar with the concept of insurance. So we don't just sell insurance to people who've never been in a wreck, right? We sell insurance to people who've been in a wreck. It just costs more. What we don't want is we don't want somebody who really can't manage a car to be on the roads, and we've got ways to do that. But there's an actuarial component to assessing risk. It's not going to be 100% foolproof all the time, but frankly, neither is bail setting. I mean, you know, I worked in the 24th Judicial District for a long time and knew a lot of judges and watched a lot of things happen in that court with regularity. No judge is perfect. Every now and then there's going to be a Willie Horton or something like that. But what you want is you want your instrument to get as tight as possible so that you can make the best decisions most of the time. And our early data says that we have the capacity to do that.
And so Ridge also says, what is the program going to be doing next year? Are we going to see a continuation of this? And will it be expanded beyond arrests that are going to criminal court? Because as I understand it right now, those are the folks who are the ones being interviewed for the risk assessment. will it be expanded ultimately to municipal court too? Will we see that, do you think?
Well, I think it's more a matter of screening. This is felony data. So let's back up for a second and talk about a little bit about how does the jurisdiction come to a point where it decides it's going to do this and how it's going to test it. Typically, these kinds of testing periods result when people say, the district attorney, the judges, and the other folks in the mix all say, okay, I'm really comfortable with these classes of cases, with these kinds of histories, you know, testing those first. But these were all felony charges. The next step would be to incorporate misdemeanors, state misdemeanors. It's really now, because as the DA noted in his conversations in the program, they moved, as a matter, again, to highlight violent crime in criminal district court, moved the misdemeanor cases over to municipal court. But that has less to do with municipal charges than it does those state misdemeanors. So that would be the next in the pecking order of the number of cases and where the best bang for the buck is in terms of applying pretrial. The next wave, if you will, would be misdemeanor. Now here's the trick. This is always the trick. And that's about scale. You know, scale happens when jurisdictions decide where they're going to place their money. I think Councilmember Guidry and others spoke directly to the question of, do we have enough money? We never have enough money to just do more. And there's a lot of work going on now in the country to get jurisdictions to really think about what they called justice reinvestment. We know that some things don't work very well. We know that some things work much better. Hardest thing in the whole world is to try and get programs and practices that have been in place for a long time to be different. I mean, as human beings, we all do this. We get attached to a particular kind of behavior, and whether it's really good for us or not, or really works or not, once we're hooked on it, we are really hooked on it. Institutions are not different. They're made up of individuals and patterns develop. So, excuse me, the question is, will we set aside the money?
Grab your water.
Thanks.
You're talking a lot, which she can do. This is a subject that she knows a lot about and can talk a lot about it.
I get too excited. So the question is scale. Will we have the funds? You know, if funds are made available, then the program will continue to increase in scope. If not, then it will be constricted according to the priorities for the jurisdiction. So where will it go? It will go where the resources allow it to go.
Where the resources are. So just to kind of sort of backtrack a little bit too on this whole idea of pretrial services and risk assessment, and whether or not someone is going to be held in jail if they were arrested based on their risk assessment, low risk as opposed to high risk, and doing this risk assessment as opposed to just relying on bond. Why is this why is this important, and how does it impact members of our community?
Well, a worst case scenario would be if you did a risk assessment, you had a high risk individual, and there was a bail override and they got out and somebody got seriously hurt.
Yeah.
That's the sort of scenario everybody dreads. Nobody wants to see that happen. So really, that's the other side of the scaling in terms of risk assessments. You want to weed out the people that don't need to use a limited resource. I mean, jail is a costly resource. So you don't want to overuse it. So, you know, your high-risk people are also going to, you know, really be identified through this. In this case, there were 3% of the people who were considered really high risk. They don't need to go anywhere else. They need to stay right where they are, and that's in jail.
Regarding the pretrial services, I know there was another question there. Well, actually, let me just move on to another one because we have talked about pretrial services a lot right now.
Well, let me just mention one other thing, because we're talking, you know, part of the reason why we underwrote this program is because we feel like, you know, folks in the community who are concerned about their own safety, the safety of their loved ones, and the community in general, you know, really get excited. Crime is a very emotional subject. So in that atmosphere that's so highly charged, and you see it when you see crime scenes on television and when people talk about it, it it simply is a very emotional, hot topic. When people are emotionally charged about a topic, it's very difficult sometimes to kind of sift through the pieces and parts to make sure that the decision making that has to happen is being done well. But you know, one of the things about looking at pretrial is it's not just about pretrial. I mean, there was the summons in lieu of arrest process that the police really had to commit to. That eliminated the use of the jail unnecessarily for people, like for out of parish traffic warrants, some of which were really quite old. No offense to any neighboring parish, but that's really their problem. You know, getting people to pay and getting people scooped up, that's really their issue. But so that's a kind of an efficiency. It has a benefit to the courts. It has a benefit to the, you know, to the budget of the jail. It helps the city be able to apportion its assets. But it also has other marginal benefits for other members of the system. You know, for example, now the same folks who are doing the screening, the pretrial assessment, are able to do a provisional determination for the DA as to whether or not folks are eligible for diversion earlier. And keep in mind that one of the things they talked about is earlier is better. Mr. Bunton talked about it. Mr. Canizero talked about it. We're getting on these cases right on time. Well, if you can divert someone and that case doesn't get on a docket, that's an efficiency. There's also an initial determination of indigency that benefits the public defender. That pretrial is there.
That's done during the risk assessment.
Right. Okay. You know, does the person have a job? It's 2 other questions or 3 other questions to get to the heart of whether or not that person might be qualified as indigent. That moves along the process of getting somebody appointed if they qualify. So the very important thing about this process of getting people working together in teams, and we have seen a lot of this since Katrina. You know, we've seen it in pretrial. We've also had teams working on property and evidence. You know, when the basement of the courthouse was flooded and everything was in disarray, I mean, the loss and the mess related to property that had been collected had to be moved out of flooded police station was awful.
It was a big mess.
But it gave all the actors involved in the cataloging and processing of property and evidence an opportunity. And they took that opportunity and they redid the system. So, you know, pretrial is one that was long in coming for the jurisdiction. As I said, we've had a history of looking at, you know, bail and bonding as a way to make better use of jail space. But that one's pretty big. But there are lots of other ones, and I think that's really the important part of this, is that there is progress being made. It's just really hard for folks who don't get to have a lot of opportunity to learn about the intricacies of the system or really even ask questions about stuff to know what that is.
We have another question here. With a moderate to high risk felony group, and this comes from Justin, would it help reduce failures to appear, risk assessment, and public safety if the initial appearance date of arraignment appears on the face of the commercial surety bond before the accused is released from incarceration?
Well, yes.
So it's the date, but that doesn't happen all the time from what I understand. So what can be done to improve that situation?
Well, at the risk of repeating myself, which is I think one of the pitfalls of doing something like this, is you're going to repeat yourself a lot.
That's okay. People are learning.
As the process improves, then you begin to fine-tune all of the interchanges that go on. So an agreement on the part of the bonding agencies, the court to enforce, you know, the jail to observe, and pretrial services to help monitor, you can ultimately get a change.
You really have a tickle in your throat.
I do. That you ultimately can get a change where that process becomes different. I mean, keep in mind, we're talking about, for example, with the going back to the police reports and the expedited process now that goes on from the point of arrest. You know, it used to be that police officers had to get in their car and drive a report downtown to file it. Thing of the past. Sitting down and talking about the nuts and bolts and mechanics of, well, what would make this work better? This really takes up a lot of time. How can we do it better? In an atmosphere where the parties aren't talking to each other, even the simplest of transactions becomes difficult. And for us, that's one of the things that we think, you know, our investments have really begun to pay off in. Repetition and practice, I think, are making a difference in getting folks to take a different approach.
Okay, so this whole effort in reinventing the criminal justice system and making it a more efficient system and creating a more fair administration of justice, all of this is, the goal of it is certainly to create a safer community, to make our streets safer. As we saw in our program, one of the components of all of this is also deals with the police department, and also now there's a consent decree in the police department. I want to bring up a quote from Police Superintendent Ronald Serpaz, and it says, "I know we're going to be a better police department, there's no question about that. I know that we're already having better rates of prosecution with quality cases with the DA. But I also know we need to have whole families taking care of their children. We need to have whole neighborhoods believing in one another's safety, thus the whole neighborhood becomes safe. Those things in the long run, with recreation, with education, with recidivism and offender reentry programs, when those things all start to come together, I don't see that there's any question that New Orleans will see a drop in murders that's sustainable over time." Once again, this whole effort that we're involved in right now is to create a safer city. Are we heading that way? Is the police department heading to where the police chief is saying it's going to get to be a really, really great police department? Are we seeing that?
Well, I think we're seeing things be put in place to make that happen. Now, again, in 3 years, when we do this again, you know, hopefully we'll be telling an updated story and a much improved story yet again. I'd like to go to something he said that's not just about the police. And let me say that I think the fact that the department is engaged in a consent decree with the federal government tells us everything we need to know about where we were before. It wasn't our purpose in doing this programming to kind of revisit all of that. I think we've been there and done that in a very public way. And there's a lot to overcome. There's a lot that the community has to heal from with regard to NOPD relations. But to the superintendent's point about what will ultimately reduce crime, you know, if community relations with the police improve, and I'm hoping everyone notes that there's been for a couple of years now a survey of community attitudes toward police. It's been up and down. There's not been a great amount of movement up or down from where we started out. I think it paints a pretty clear picture of kind of the slope that we're on in terms of improving police-community relations. But all the evaluation research that's been generated around police in the community over the last couple of decades tells us that if the police and the members of the community don't have a decent relationship, people aren't going to report crimes. They're not going to feel comfortable talking to them. And I think the superintendent and every man and woman who wears a uniform in New Orleans knows that at some level. Yeah. So that's a to-be-worked-on thing. I think what might be sort of a lesser attended part of his statement is this. We have yet to really endorse the idea that in the same way that the criminal justice system needs to work together to make criminal justice processes more efficient and more effective, the community as a whole has to come together to really figure out how it's going to improve the quality of life for people who, for a variety of reasons, gravitate onto what we refer to as criminal pathways. This doesn't start, in most instances, it doesn't start when someone turns into an adolescent. You know, there's lots of stuff that we know about youth development that tells us when we should be noticing that children are in trouble. Many of those issues we see very plainly in the school environment. So as we're looking at school reform, one of the things we think we really need to be cognizant of, and we didn't address the juvenile justice issues largely as a matter of resource constraint. I mean, we could do a program a week from now in perpetuity to track these kinds of things. What we're trying to do is hit major big areas where we think we have both long-standing challenges and some hope that things will improve. But if we're going to have a healthier community where there's less crime, we have to have parents, we have to have neighborhoods, we have to have schools, and we have to have concerned other adults, all of whom buy into the notion that each one of those components has a role in keeping folks out of this system. There are a lot of efforts in the community that speak to that, but I think that the one thing that is yet to be done is to really focus those efforts at scale, again, at scale. It's not to say there aren't really good programs, but when you've got a set of clogged arteries and you're at, you've got plaque and you're a walking heart attack, as doctors often say, at that point they no longer say take an aspirin every day. What they say is, come on in, let's clean this stuff out, let's do a bypass or whatever other complex solution has to be done in order to make this thing happen. So I think, one of the things we really have to wrap our arms around is what's the, on a continuum of how do we make things really better. What are we going to do on this, sort of more front-end type of thing? Because it's a whole deal that has to happen.
Let me bring up another quote. This is from New Orleans Inspector General Ed Quatrevo, and he was addressing, the rate of violence that we do have here in this area and what it's going to take to try to solve this problem. He says our rate is 56 homicides per 100,000. Then that rate, even if you only counted the innocent bystanders, would still be third in the country. That's how bad it is, so we've got to do something. New York City did something. They reduced their homicide rate 80% over a 20-year period. An economic analysis indicates that about half of that can be attributed to good policing and policing strategies. But to execute those strategies, you need an efficient and effective police force. We have such a terrible problem. We need the best police force in the United States. An okay police force is not going to be up to this challenge. And so I'm going to go to a question that has come in from Charles Kern, Lieutenant Charles Kern, retired, and he identifies himself as Shreveport PD. Why isn't more emphasis placed on NOPD human resources, hiring practices, and potential recruit qualifications? Seems to me that it should begin here, the same as basic training in the military, by sorting out applicants who cannot and will not excel at the initial level. The wink and a nod has to be eliminated. Well, we touched on that a bit.
Right.
The police chief mentioned about that, about the new requirements now for NOPD. And certainly that is a move ahead and a move forward. Is this, as you see it, an important part of improving policing in the city?
It is. It's critically important, and I think Lieutenant Kern asks a good question. And again, this is one of those, how would you know? And sometimes in New Orleans, given historical issues with the police, sometimes people don't believe. But this is an example of how things can move along. The mayor and the superintendent asked the business community and the philanthropic community in New Orleans to assist them in addressing exactly these kinds of issues. So there's funding being made available and technical assistance being made available to help overhaul the process by which police officers are evaluated. Mm-hmm. There will be along with that, changes to the greater civil service system in which the police personnel are embedded. These kinds of jobs, and this is true with a lot of sort of systems change things, it's incredibly tedious. I've had occasion to be at parties where people ask you the casual, so what do you do kind of thing. And when you start talking about systems change, and you might be getting real amped up about it, they sort of, their eyes glaze over. And as my brother once told me after we were having a conversation about this kind of thing, he said, if you don't mind, I'm just going to tell people you work for the CIA and you can't talk about it because it's easier than trying to understand this stuff. So, you know, overhauling some ways that you control quality, you have to do in spite of until you reform civil service. And then within an organization the size of NOPD with the history it has, you have to go in again and kind of take the existing system apart, using consultants that have done this in other police departments around the country. And we now have, along with the city's funds, philanthropic funds that will allow us to do this. That process is moving along.
You know, another quote I thought was interesting, and it's just really sort of, it indicates the way the police feel that it's very important that the community work with them in order to keep our streets safe. This is the superintendent says the police, you have to police the city the way the city comes to you, said the police superintendent. Not everybody in the city of New Orleans is worried about murder.
Right.
There are many neighborhoods in New Orleans where murder is not the problem. We go to neighborhood meetings every week. We've had over 716 neighborhood meetings this year alone in full uniform, and people hardly talk about crime. They talk about abandoned houses, they talk about blight, they talk about street lights, they talk about street conditions, they talk about speeding, they talk about drug dealing, they talk about just general kids on the corner that kind of scare me. Those are probably the first 7 things we hear in every single meeting. And if we can fix some of those problems, then police will come to us and say, all right, I'm just going to whisper in your ear right now because I actually know who killed Tom around the corner. That's the ticket. Is that the ticket? Is that really what it's going to take to make the streets safer in the city of New Orleans?
I don't know if there's an it that makes the streets safer. I think that the overriding point that the superintendent is trying to get out there is, in every neighborhood, it's not the same problem. And let's be honest about this. I mean, the city of neighborhoods that New Orleans is creates a lot of challenges for people. And I think it would be disingenuous not to own that some people in some neighborhoods feel like when the police come to meetings, there's distrust on both sides. And so in some neighborhoods, this kind of environment that he says that they want to help create is going to happen a lot faster than in some other neighborhoods where there's just simply more to overcome. Right. Is it important? It's critically important. I mean, all over the country, you can look at evaluation research about what makes an effective police department, and where there is communication between citizens and police, more crime gets solved. It gets solved more quickly. There are critics of the concept of Crime Stoppers, you know, and that it creates a sort of environment where you're incentivizing people to rat other people out. I think that's an inescapable reality. You are. However, the fact that it does get results frequently tells us something about how much people want to, and so their motives might not be what we would think are entirely pure. Mm-hmm. No question about crime and safety, or crime and punishment, crime and justice, is as neat or as clean or as black and white as we would like for it to be. And I think that's one of the benefits of thinking about this as a long view. You know, over the long haul, the more that the system, and I'm going to take just a moment here to draw some parallels, that there are other people that really won't like this. The police, the district attorney, the judges, and other folks that constitute the system, if they don't model a particular kind of behavior, they're going to have a hard time getting the respect of the citizenry. You know, we can preach all we want to about who shouldn't steal, who shouldn't do drugs, who shouldn't do this, and who shouldn't do that. Meanwhile, if we don't have public systems that in the public view are holding themselves accountable, I'm afraid that's not going to work as well as we would like it to do. So the more processing there is about real problems, and the more there are real solutions where everybody does something a little bit different, the better off we are. That applies to the system, it applies to neighborhoods, it applies to citizens as a whole. You know, at one point I owned a house in Bywater, and the house was burglarized. That wasn't uncommon. I had 4 houses that were burglarized in a period of about 10 years. not unlike anybody else, no big deal, right? One of those burglaries was committed by the NOPD.
Oh.
Now, that bothered me enormously, as you might imagine.
Yes.
And, you know, quite naturally, I had some issues with that. The fact of the matter is, in that neighborhood at that time, there was a fair amount of stuff going on with the police, and me and most of my neighbors kept a wary eye out. Hopefully, those conditions are changing, but I don't think there's anybody that lives in the city that doesn't have a tale to tell, directly or indirectly. History lingers. You know, when you look at families, like particularly big families, my mother's family was a big family, people still talk about, you know, in 1979 when, you know, Uncle so-and-so did such and such, and, you know, it was 20 years until somebody forgave him. On a much grander scale, you know, we've got to get things out there, talk about them, process them, you know, own up to some things that we're really very uncomfortable about, and then move forward. I don't think anybody's really in a position to dispute anything specific that the superintendent said, but they're going to people are going to feel differently about it from one neighborhood to the other.
And something else that he told us, he said they get 9,500 calls for service per week, and about 50 of those are involving some sort of assault. So they're pretty busy, but as he said, not every neighborhood has a murder in it. That's just not all around the city. One question that we had come in is, whatever happened to the idea of a sobering center? Instead of bringing someone who's picked up for public drunkenness to central lockup, you bring them to a place where they could just kind of sleep it off, and they don't have to be brought to jail. Is that still out there?
You know, I'm gonna have to say, if there's a way that we could find this information for whoever sent the question in, I'd be happy to follow up. But there was a series of attempts made to find a way to do several things. Number one, identify a place, find the money, always a concern. And this one got tossed around quite a bit. Local providers, the Metropolitan Human Services District, the police, and others problem solved around this. But, you know, here's the deal. We have a tendency to want to use existing resources to the max and then beyond. So the problem is that if you have an existing center, and this is where I lost track of it, you know, several months ago, is that was there an existing provider who was already open and had the staffing to accommodate? The sobering center would have to be a 24-hour-a-day thing. There are not a lot of 24-hour facilities, and if you don't have the money to keep it open the 24 hours, that and other logistical issues kind of put up stumbling blocks, not the least of which is, and this is always true as well, that's an additional liability. If you're trying to use a community provider, let's be fair. I mean, they're assuming a responsibility that's not in their normal course of business. So I don't think the idea is dead, and I want to say that there was a later discussion taken up about working out something within the construct of the jail, and that may actually have happened, but to be honest, I don't know. The idea didn't die, and I think it may even be live in a different format.
We have another question that's come in from Justin, who is concerned about people getting the court dates, and he asked, how is someone expected to appear in court if the date and time is not given when someone is released? If I receive a parking traffic or camera ticket, I'm given a date and a time to appear. Why are persons that are arrested not given this basic information? I've you know, heard it before earlier from Justin, but I've heard it before that as well. Yeah. Is that something that the pretrial services program is trying to assist with also?
Yes.
Because don't they call people?
Yes, they do. They've called almost 100% of folks, and when they do that, they get a tremendous response. A lot of pretrial systems in the country focus attention on two things. Number one is reminder notices, and the second one is some level of supervision that's calibrated to the possibility that that individual might not turn up. You know, someone, for example, who doesn't have a stable residence. might take a little extra effort to keep track of that individual over time, between the time of that they're released and the time they have to come to court. So the more that we incorporate those practices that are known to be effective, the higher our rates will be and the more people will do that. But that's another one of those, here's a marginal benefit. Whose responsibility has it been really? And historically this practice just developed where, you know, people left not knowing and they had to follow up and it didn't work, but then what do we do about it? And that's why these kinds of more targeted working together things produce a better result. And Justin, I hope to goodness that you'll feel better knowing that, you know, people are getting reminders and hopefully somebody is going to take that cause up even more strongly.
You know, as we start to get close to wrapping up our conversation now, there was something else that I wanted to note, and this is a quote that I want to bring up from the Municipal Court Chief Judge Desiree Charbonnet, and this is something that she is seeing, and it's something that you touched on a little bit before. And she says, we still have a serious crime problem, which we certainly know. One of the biggest things that I see, it weighs heavy on me sometimes in court, is the amount of young people that are involved in crime. It's sad, and if an individual really paid attention, they would see that it is a definite group, an age group, that are at risk for participating in a crime. And that's really sort of relevant today as we are doing this web chat, because fairly recently there was a armed robbery and carjacking and a shooting that did involve young people, and also involved one young person who was actually on a monitoring bracelet, an ankle bracelet. It didn't work. It just didn't work. It failed. You know, what are we doing to really address that? I mean, that's a functional problem of the ankle bracelet, and what is being done to make sure that those things are not malfunctioning? But the larger question is the younger people that this judge is seeing, this group of people. They're young, they're coming up from juvenile court, many of them, into her court. As she said, they call it the big court, and she sees them just coming in repeatedly, having committed even more serious crimes. What can be done? Well,
remember I said earlier that we needed to think about criminal behavior as being a trajectory. There's lots of stuff that's been printed and lots of efforts that have been undertaken around the country to help jurisdictions really wrap their arms around a more comprehensive strategy to address that. But you have to make a commitment to really figuring it out. You've heard the term, as I'm sure most people have, of people falling through the cracks. We have lots of language to describe the various ways that this happens. You know, now it's the school to prison pipeline where, you know, children who aren't attached to school, this is one of the big correlates of people turning up in criminal behavior, is they're not in school. When children are not in school, they are not doing something probably that's particularly fruitful for them. It's age appropriate for children to be getting an education. So, you know, when you start looking at the pathways that children follow who are not successfully attached to school early, who stay attached and do well in school, what ends up happening is children move from, I'll use the testing terminology to help ground us a little bit. So they pass the 4th grade LEAP test and they enter middle school. And then things start to get wobbly because peers become more of an influence. School becomes more challenging, and children who are going to struggle and ultimately not make it are going to fall through that crack somewhere probably between 5th and 8th grades. You know, we worry a lot, as well we should, about graduation cohorts. Kids who enter the 9th grade and then who don't graduate. But there's a cohort younger than that, or earlier than that, of children who are not succeeding coming out of middle school. So the question I think that goes to Judge Charbonnet's point is, and it's a good one, is that we have to have an appropriate calibrated response at every step along the way where people are likely to fall through. I'll go back to my you don't take an aspirin for a heart attack thing, and say that, you know, one of the things we do medically to manage our risk is we get a physical. You know, we attend to signs, we track cholesterol, we track our exercise programs, we track our diet, and so on. And, you know, I think it's a question, again, going back to something the superintendent said, it's a question for the community. Are we tracking what's happening with our children? You know, there are really not an incredible number of filings in juvenile court in Orleans Parish. You know, the volume is not exorbitant. And children can have brushes with the court that are not criminal. They can be status offenses. The labeling of something as being serious or bad or predictive of something worse doesn't really revolve around whether it's delinquency or status offending or even whether it's misdemeanor or felony. I mean, I've run programs where children come in and they're coming into a form of a diversion program, but after you've assessed them and interviewed them 2 or 3 times, you know good and well they're on the fast track to serious trouble because they signal that by some of the behaviors that they show you. The same thing is true with children all along pathways to serious crime. So the question is, you know, what are we doing to help cut that off earlier? And I don't think we have such a strategy developing. I think we get our adult system a little bit better lined up. We begin to pay more attention to our school systems, and we can do more about early warning signs that help us really figure this stuff out.
Major challenge. Let me ask you this, as we do start to wrap this up. This now has been a process. It's an ongoing effort. Just putting it in a time frame, in our time frame, between 2008 and when we did our, WYES did our first program about this, and now this follow-up 2012, what do you feel have been the major accomplishments so far? Well,
as bizarre as this might seem, I think that having the consent decree for the police lined up is a big thing. I think some of the mechanical processes of the system and the acknowledgement that comes before it that says we got to do this better. Summons in lieu of arrest is huge. When Sheriff Fody left office, there were almost 7,100 beds in the Orleans Parish Prison. There are now north of 2,000. We don't know what the final number will be, but needless to say, compared to 7,100, the number's gone down considerably. The reality is that summons in lieu of arrest took a big bite out of the need for beds, and it just made things a lot more just for people on the street. That's a big one. The fact that the time frames, and I think Mr. Cannizzaro referenced this in his remarks, the time frames between arrest and charging and arraignment and arraignment to trial or disposition have shortened incredibly. I mean, it's really quite astonishing. It needed to change, it has changed, and what that tells us, it can change. So those things, which really are markers of efficiency, the system is more efficient. The next thing is we have to get more effective. Every practice that we engage in, you know, how we use drug treatment, how we use mental health treatment, how we identify people that need to even be in treatment, how we follow up on that. Supervision strategies, the right mix of ankle bracelets versus, you know, more intensive person supervision. All of those are going to speak directly to effectiveness, because we still measure effectiveness in large part by how well people get away from criminal pathways and on to something else. So, you know, that I think is what we can be proud of what's happened so far, and we can look ahead and say, you know, the question of effectiveness is one that will be the big challenge going forward. Focusing on violent offenses too. Yes. Thank you so much, Lucia. Well, thank you for asking me. I appreciate it. Thank you for all of the help that you're giving us in getting more information out to the community about this ongoing effort, important effort. Well, we hope it's helpful, and naturally, although I'm a generalist, I'm not an expert in everything, and I hope that one of the things the programs will do is we'll encourage the public to ask questions. We can get mad, we can get glad, we can get at a podium and criticize whomever, but I think we have to get involved as informed citizens. And at the end of the day, we hope these programs will be a tool to help people do that.
Make good decisions, and
Exactly.
like you said, informed decisions.
Right.
And also, let me note, we're going to keep that box up where people have been sending questions, and we'll send them over to Lucia and try to get responses up on our WYES website, our Reshaping a Greater New Orleans Criminal Justice website. And I really do thank you guys for watching, and everybody who sent in questions. I really do appreciate that, as does Lucia. I know we're interested
Sure.
in finding out more about what you guys are thinking, getting comments, perhaps some suggestions, ideas about what directions you'd like to see us move in terms of our future programs. And there will be a couple of other programs over the next year. We're going to continue to look into this issue. So have a good weekend, everybody. Thanks for joining us, and good night.